All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Plastic Pollution After the Treaty Stalemate. We'll let everyone filter in here. We'll give it a few minutes before we get started. But we just wanted to thank you for joining us and mention that we have a Q&A option at the bottom of the screen for anyone out there who might want to ask some questions, and we'll get to them at the end. We'll get to as many of them as we can, time permitted, before the end of the hour. So make sure to use that Q&A option there. Um, okay, let's give it a sec for some more people to filter in here. I think we can move to the next slide and we'll begin some introductions. I'll start with myself. I'm Dustin Zimmer, I'm a marketer, I'm a managing marketer of growth and generation for Climco. And then we have our amazing guests here. Stephanie Beitien, who's coming to us from Germany, is the managing director and board member at PCX Solutions. She focuses on plastic policy, manages a standard for plastic credits, and advises governments and companies on plastic responsibility. Steffi Chukla is coming to us from Spain. She is the government affairs director for Okeanos Group, and she leads the company's policy and legislative strategy to advance sustainable alternatives to plastic. Stephanie Heffelfinger comes to us from America in Pennsylvania. She's a project manager at Climco, and she's worked to develop one of the first projects to issue credits under the Verra standard. Her focus is on developing carbon credit projects in the waste management sector. And last but certainly not least, we have Anna Stablem, who's a business development director at Climco, and she has extensive experience in commodities and was instrumental in developing one of the world's first exchanges for carbon, creating a spot trading platform for high quality carbon credits. So we have a great list of speakers for you and coming to you from all over the world. So Singapore, Spain, Germany, America, we're all over. So I don't know where you are, but thank you for joining us, whatever time zone you might be in. All right. We're going to go over the agenda quickly here before I pass it off to Anna. First, we're going to cover the Global Plastic Treaty, which you are probably familiar with since you joined this webinar. We're going to cover domestic regulation, go over the basics of what is a plastic credit, uh, spotlight the future of the plastic industry, and then, like I mentioned, have some time for Q&A. So once again, I want to make sure that if you're joining us now, that you notice the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. Please put any questions you have in there, and we'll answer them at the end. And as we go along, at the end of the presentation, we'll also have our email addresses on the final slide. So please reach out to us with any questions you might have about plastic recovery projects, the credit verification process, this treaty, or just any of your sustainability questions in general. We'd be happy to answer them. All right, so I'm going to pass it off to Anna, and we can get started. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dustin. Thanks a lot for the introduction. So I'm pleased to be here today to talk about this extremely important topic that is plastic and plastic pollution, and raise awareness about potential solutions and actions that we can take now after the plastic negotiations in Geneva failed. I'm sure that is no surprise, unfortunately, at this point. I'm here to just give you a quick overview of some of the key issues from the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. So next slide, please, Steph. It was the fifth session. The negotiations have been ongoing for 3 years. And the first part, so it's called 5.2 because the first part was in South Korea in December. So what you see here on this slide, for most countries, key was really to create a legally binding agreement to curb plastic pollution. And what you can see is basically across the full life cycle. So from using less virgin plastic on the left to the design, production, and then the use, and then importantly, the disposal and waste management. So some of the key ambitions included global limits on the production of plastics, and even considering caps or moratoriums on new production facilities. So, as you're very familiar, I'm sure already with plastics, but these synthetic polymers are, of course, a significant environmental challenge for two main reasons. The first is that the current production is reliant on petrochemical products, the majority of them, And plastic production accounts for 3 to 5.5%, depending a little bit on which source that you're using, of global greenhouse gas emissions. Most of these emissions come when you convert fossil fuels into plastic materials and then the associated energy use. And then you have a small proportion as well that comes basically from the end of life management of plastics. Maybe you know as well that plastic production is doubled between year 2000 to 2019. So we're now producing 460 million tons per year, and this number is just expected to increase. So in 2040, we're expecting to produce around 740 million metric tons. To lower the virgin plastic pollution is something that Steffi will talk to us a little bit later here at the webinar. And what I wanted to show as well on this slide is, of course, that the second challenge is the disposal of plastics. And again, no news for people that are reading the news that microplastics have been found in our lungs, in our livers, and even in the placentas of newborn babies. So there is plastic basically everywhere. Around 20 million tons come out in the environment per year. The majority, 11 million more or less, goes out in the ocean. And of course, as we produce more plastics and use more plastics, this number is expected to triple over the next 20 years. So solving this twofold issue was kind of the key for these negotiators coming to Geneva. One other important discussion point was to ban toxic chemicals. So it's not just about plastics being everywhere. The material is obviously poisonous. So of the 16,000 plus chemicals in plastics, more than 1/4 is known to be hazardous to human health, but the majority has not even been tested yet, basically how dangerous these chemicals are. The negotiators also wanted plastics that's easier to recover and recycle. And you know that it's really expensive, much more expensive to recycle plastics than use virgin plastics. But if we could facilitate by having a better design how to separate, that would, of course, lower those costs. Another thing that we will talk about later at the webinar, and that's Stephanie, that will be going through extended producer responsibility and circular economy. So 91% of the world's plastic waste is not recycled. It means, of course, that there are a lot of opportunities for recycling companies. And there's a lot of debate, of course, that we should see some of this plastic not as waste, but basically as a resource. If we do have the right infrastructure in place, this used plastic can be really useful materials. But in this instance, we were talking about the plastic pollution, of course, and negotiators wanted harmonized global rules on EPRs to drive innovation, reduce single-use plastics, and move towards a circular economy. And on that note, seeing it more like a waste, if you look at the value of the global plastic market, it's around 580 billion in year 2020. And if you look at the cost of waste management, that's around 40 billion. So there's a lot of money basically being spent, of course, in trying to reduce plastic pollution and put in infrastructure and waste management services. Another thing in relation to that cost was, of course, that negotiators were talking about how we're going to finance this. And there were proposals for plastic fees and taxes, maybe money in a global fund that could help specifically developing countries with waste management and recycling infrastructure. So the developing countries really had a special kind of voice during these negotiations. They were pushing for legally binding commitments from wealthier nations to try and provide financial and technical assistance. They know that the technology might not be there. They wanted basically to have technology transfers from richer countries to help on, for example, pollution control technologies. Also capacity building, which is a big thing, of course, how we can support more waste management improvements in developing countries. What we know, of course, is that the negotiations ended The delegates basically thought it was better to have no treaty instead of a weak treaty. And what we know now is that negotiations will resume, but we don't know when. So next slide, please, Steph. What was interesting, of course, was that there is a large majority of countries that favored a cap on plastic output. The countries that were in opposition were mainly the powerful oil and gas producing nations, and they said that a cap would increase the cost of plastic that we need for daily life, and they prefer to focus a treaty on waste management, reuse, and recycling. I think it's interesting to understand a little bit why these countries, especially the smaller countries like small island developing states, why they were arguing for the production caps, because they say that plastic pollution is really disproportionately harming their nations. They don't have enough land for waste storage, and they're heavily dependent on imported goods, and it's all coming in plastics, which basically means that they're highly exposed to plastic pollution without actually contributing to any of the plastic production problems. They also said, of course, that plastic pollution is threatening our livelihoods. We're dependent on fisheries, on tourism, and with plastic pollution, as we know, the environment is being severely damaged. So without limits on production, they feel like they are being overwhelmed and they don't have the capacity to deal with plastics. There were 1,500 unresolved sections in the draft text. It wasn't maybe a surprise for some. The countries come with obviously very different interests, and there were several really key points that were hard to agree on. And developing countries were also very frustrated for the lack of a provision of consent for plastic waste exports. They basically receive a lot of plastics kind of not like that they don't necessarily want, and they legally wanted to have they require basically these exporting countries to obtain consent from importing countries before sending this plastic waste. There was also criticism around the process, and now these agreements need to happen in consensus. And a lot of people have said that the structure of the negotiations would mean that it would be really hard to come to an agreement, and that maybe voting should be the way forward. But I will leave it here, and I wanted to just ask Steffi, because I know you've been following these negotiations very closely, if there's anything that I missed, or if there's something that you kind of had in mind when you were watching these negotiations, and what your takeaways were. And then we're going to
Yeah.
go to Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, I think you did a pretty good rundown of what has been happening with the treaty, which has been a lot. I just think it's important to remark what this failure represents, because the breakdown of negotiations is not just another diplomatic failure. In a way, it represents, in my opinion, a massive missed opportunity for market transformation. From my perspective in the sustainable packaging industry and working closely with governments, this collapse highlights the absence of the clear and the global standards that the world really needed to create like a level playing field for innovations and for solution to an issue that at the end of the day it's impacting everyone, not just a select few. But yeah, the collapse of talks in Geneva came 9 months after the failure of what was originally meant to be the final round of negotiations. So, in all honesty, I can't say that this outcome wasn't expected personally, but it's still very disappointing because the global plastic treaty could have provided the regulatory certainty needed to accelerate investment in alternative materials, in circular economy solutions, and just new business models in general. But we're left with uncertainty, which continues to hang over all these sustainable packaging markets and major brands, slowing down progress, creating uneven conditions across jurisdictions. So again, this essentially shifts the responsibility back onto the innovation and voluntary action as the drivers for change, as they might prove more effective than trying to get more than 100 countries to agree on global targets. And so what we can expect, in my opinion, is the pace of change to remain very fragmented, and of course lower than what it could have been under a global framework. But in short, what we are witnessing is just sorry, a moment where governments have missed the chance to really drive transformation, and the burden now falls into companies, innovators, and the civil society as a whole to push forward.
Thanks for that, Steffi. I fully agree, and I can't help but think that normally corporates, they want harmonization, they want standardization, and what we're left with is fragmentation at this point. But it is interesting, of course, that countries are still moving ahead, and I will hand over to Stephanie, and she will tell us more about basically how countries can move forward, but by themselves and not under this global umbrella that we were hoping for.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot, Anna, for having me. A webinar with 3 Stephs is certainly something special, so I'm really happy to be here today. Yeah, so I actually followed the last 4 rounds of negotiations because PCX Solution, we are an official observer organization to the UN Global Treaty process. And our founder is also part of the Philippine delegation. So we have the observer view, but also then the inside view of a country delegation. And while we are, of course, all disappointed, actually, some of the negotiators that are professional negotiators that are handling with those agreements on different aspects as well, they are telling me that it's already a very fast process in comparison, for example, with the Paris Climate Agreement. That just helped to make it a bit more relative, but of course it feels way too slow if you consider the amount of plastic that keeps on entering nature, that it's accumulating in our oceans and rivers. So we were all hoping for a final treaty text. So we still have to continue to hope. And for ourselves as an organization, it just means that our work is even more important now with the lack of a global treaty. So we are involved in plastic policy. We help on financing waste management through plastic credits, and we help companies as well to address their full plastic footprint. I think for me, the positive side of this whole INC process is that it had already sparked a lot of good initiatives and especially brought together many organizations that are working on the issue. Just to give a couple of examples, from GEF, the Global Environment Facility, they launched a big program called Reboot. You can look it up in the internet. It was officially launched in Geneva. It spans across 15 countries that are hard hit by the plastic crisis, and it has a funding of over $100 million US. It will mainly focus on upstream and midstream reduction, especially in the F&B sector. So there are good things already happening thanks to to this process. But yeah, hoping that it will get more and more intense. So if we go to the next slide, it shows that there is one positive development already, that is the spread of extended producer responsibility schemes, EPR in short, all around the globe. EPR for packaging I'm referring to. This was also one of the few points of convergence in the treaty. So even countries that are opposing an ambitious treaty, they are still in favor of EPR with, well, a little bit different forms or targets, or whether it should be mandatory or not. But even countries that are against a strong treaty, they are often looking at EPR schemes for their own countries. So that's something which is actually happening. EPR is a policy basically where a company needs to take responsibility of the plastic and packaging that they are bringing into the market. And it can have slightly different forms and targets, but the main idea remains the same. So we are currently looking at around 70 countries that already have enacted EPR schemes, and there are many more in the pipeline which are currently being discussed. Yeah, I think the classical European EPR schemes, they're a bit more like a waste management fee, while there are some newer schemes coming up, for example, the California EPR, where they already put source reduction at the core of the EPR scheme. So as I mentioned, there are a bit of different forms. Next slide, please. Yeah, while most EPR schemes are national in nature, in the US, we have the situation that it is on state level. So as of today, there are 7 US states that have enacted EPR for packaging. They are California, Colorado, Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington. They are already enacted. They are still in various stages of implementation. So the timelines for full operations are different in those states, but they all require producers to take both financial and logistical responsibility. And there are around 12 states in the pipeline where either the bill has been introduced or they are in stage of needs assessment. So there is a lot happening. Now, obviously, for companies, that might also be a bit challenging to not only look at 70 national laws in different countries, but then looking also at many different state level laws. So that was to your point of fragmentation. There is definitely that risk if there is no harmonized treaty that basically sets the guardrails that every EPR scheme looks different. So basically what we are advising to the companies is to get ahead and maybe not wait for regulation in the first place to kick in, but already to start and to gather data, for example, on their packaging footprint throughout their supply chains, which is often one of the big concerns, to map out their processes, but also to already identify areas of potential reduction and avoidance, because obviously any plastic that is avoided, they don't have to take responsibility for. So that's some of the advice that we are giving to companies. Also companies that move early to address the topic, they are getting more involved by lawmakers. They can maybe form part of technical working groups and so on to already give their inputs and see how to make it practically work for them. That's also how it happened in the Philippines, where companies were consulted early in the process, and so they were part of the solution, which actually brings me to my next topic. If we go to the next slide. I want to explain the EPR in the Philippines today, as it works a little bit different in comparison to the classical EPR schemes, for example, that is implemented in most European countries. It also serves as an example that a developing country, which actually has been really hard hit by the plastic crisis, can implement an ambitious EPR law in a very short time and then improve on the go. So that's happening. The law was enacted 2 years ago. It's now the 3rd year of implementation. But they are still improving and refining guidance and so on. So that's also just a voice from the global south to look at, to give some example for other developing countries as well. So what works different is that responsibility is measured in weight and not in fees. So to explain that better, it means that a company has to measure their footprint in tons and has to get this footprint also third-party audited. And then based on that footprint, let's say 100 metric tons, they have to take a growing percentage of responsibility. So in the first year, it was 20%, and then 40% last year, 50% this year, goes up to 80% in 2028. That means that they have to take responsibility of 80% of their footprint, which is quite ambitious, also in comparison to other EPR schemes. Yeah, they mainly distinguish between flexibles and rigids. So to give some distinction to the material, but not make it too difficult to report or not too granular. And the interesting thing is that there are 6 upstream measures in the law with which the companies can reduce their footprint. And then there are 6 downstream measures that help companies to recover their footprint. That means to take responsibility. And basically, plastic credits are one of those downstream measures that companies can use to take responsibility of their footprint. The plastic credits basically help to make money flow directly into waste management. And now in the third year of compliance, where we have 50% already, the price of the plastic credits then start to hurt. So the companies are looking into ways to reduce their footprint. So there's a built-in incentive basically to reduce, with again, is not always the case in other EPR schemes. Yeah, if we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, that just shows that plastic credits basically can change the unit economic of plastic. So if you make a company take responsibility for their plastic footprint, for example, in form of plastic credits, you basically add the cost of the credit to the low virgin plastic price, and thereby you reduce the price gap to alternative materials or recycled content, which is still more expensive. Because yeah, a lot of people say actually recycled content is too expensive, but the reality is that virgin plastic is too cheap, to be honest, because all the externalities are not priced in. So plastic credits can help on the one side to generate like immediate impact. We have under our standard, for example, we have a combined capacity of 250 million kg that could be deployed basically today. But they can also help to change the long-term unit economics of plastic. And they are based on the polluter pays principle, so similar to EPR. So that means that plastic credits can either be fully embedded in EPR schemes, like in the Philippines, or they can be used as a transition measure to prepare for EPR schemes, for example, in voluntary PRO. So yeah, just to summarize, they can help build, like, they have a role as innovative financing mechanism. They don't need to wait for the global treaty. They can be deployed today, and they can be tailored to locality and different plastic types. But in order to have an impact, they also need to follow rigorous standards, obviously. We as a standard setter have to make that note. So yeah, while we are waiting for the next INC, those plastic credits can already help provide funding for the highly underfunded waste management sector basically today. And with that, I give over to Steph. And obviously, I look forward to any questions that you might have in the Q&A later. Thank you.
So Stephanie set up plastic credits quite nicely, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what plastic credits are, the use case for them, and give a few examples of some real-life plastic credit projects. So what is a plastic credit? Generally, one plastic credit represents a metric ton or 1 kilogram of plastic removed from the environment or recycled. And I say metric ton or kilogram, it depends on the standard and the registry. However, not all credits are made equal. It's important to choose projects that abide by the core principles of high quality credits. And this includes a few different things: being measurable through clear measurements and procedures, being real, which can be proven using a rigorous, conservative, well-recognized accounting standard, is only counted once, also known as no double counting. You want to make sure a project isn't trying to claim the same activity or material multiple times, or under multiple registries, or that two companies are trying to claim the same credit. You also want to make sure a credit is independently audited or verified, and this is built into plastic credit standards like VERA and PCX. You also want to make sure that the project is additional, and this is a big buzzword you might want to hear. It basically just means the project is beyond business as usual, and it wouldn't have happened without the plastic credit revenue. You also want to make sure, beyond all of this, that a project respects the rights and values of its stakeholders, and that all local communities that may be impacted are considered and included. You also want to make sure that a project can stand behind any claimed impacts of the project itself, and this usually comes from it being independently audited. Plastic credits have two main uses: on the project itself and on the buyer side. So on the project side, they solely exist to provide funding to projects that otherwise would not be able to exist. In many areas in the world, there is not a formal waste management sector, and a large number of informal waste workers risk their lives to clean up their communities. In other areas, there may be formal waste management, but particularly with recycling, it is lacking or does not exist. From a buyer perspective, purchasers of credits are supporting these projects and doing a critical and necessary task in their community. But there are other reasons to buy credits as well. It isn't always possible to reduce plastic consumption to zero, and this is certainly not the case as consumption is increasing, and this allows companies to offset their plastic waste. And even without a plastic treaty, there are several frameworks, voluntary and mandated, including EPR, like Stephanie mentioned earlier. And even if a company is not mandated under an EPR scheme or any other framework to report their plastic consumption, they can be a leader in this space because this is ultimately where we're heading. So there's a few different players within the plastic credit process, and without any one of them, the credit would not exist. So firstly, you have the project owner, and they're the one doing the activity, whether that's collection or recycling. They're sometimes also the project developer. The project developer can also be someone like Climeco, as developing a project can be daunting and detailed. There's quantification and tracking of the plastic waste and weights, interacting with the auditor and the registry to answer any questions and upload documentation. And with someone like Climeco involved, the project can focus on what they do best, which is managing plastic waste. The registry is the standard setter, and this is what sets up a high-quality project. It defines what needs to be quantified, measured, and tracked, and I have a few examples on the screen. The registry also sets the requirement for a third-party audit, but this is an entirely separate organization. They are an outside third party that ensures the project meets all the requirements set by the registry or standard setter. Most importantly, the financing of a project does not exist without the sale of the plastic credit. Someone must sell the credit, as the registries generally only maintain the standard. But once the credit is transacted and sold, it can be retired, and the purchaser can claim that they help support the reduction of plastic waste. Plastic projects are extremely diverse, and I wanted to provide a few different examples, but they have the same goal in mind, and that's manage the plastic waste in the world. And on the screen are two projects that Climeco has helped on their plastic credit journey. So first is Ton to Ton. They are based in Cambodia and Vietnam, and they issued the world's first plastic credit project a few years ago. They recover ocean-bound waste from waterways and marine plastic waste. And then The Way, or Women and Youth Project, is located in Cote d'Ivoire, and they collect plastic from the open environment, and they produce sturdy, flame-resistant bricks to build schools for local communities lacking sufficient capacity in partnership with UNICEF. If you want to learn more about these projects, please contact us at Climeco. But for now, I'm going to pass it over to Steffi.
Thank you, Steph, and thanks all for joining today and for Climeco for the great opportunity to take part on this webinar. So during my presentation, I'll be sharing a perspective on the plastics industry with a focus on what the private sector can realistically do today to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and virgin plastics use. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as we all know, the industry sector faces dual pressure. On the one hand, the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and on the other, the urgency to cut virgin plastics use and contribute to ameliorating the plastic pollution crisis. So of course, there are innovative solutions underway. We see progress in material substitution, such as calcium carbonate blends, bio-based polymers, recycled content, among others. There's also efforts in designing for circularity, like monomaterial packaging, refill systems, reuse models, plastic credits, etc. And then at the production level, there is also work being done on carbon smart manufacturing. So like integrating renewable energy and improving efficiency and so on. But it's important to look critically at these trends, I believe. because change so far has been incremental rather than transformative. I would argue this means that although industry is doing improvements, these don't fundamentally alter the systems of plastic production and consumption. So transformative change instead would mean, rethinking the whole system itself, like redesigning supply chains, shifting away from single-use plastic formats, etc. Obviously, this is not to take away from what is being done today, and a small change is better than nothing. However, we can say that many of the regulatory changes that we see nowadays, which target the plastic industry, do not really cut dependence on virgin plastic use at its root, right? We also see how often recycling is presented as a silver bullet in regulations across the globe, yet globally rates for recycling remain pretty low, so below the 10%. And although the concept is good, the lack of infrastructure and investment, it's an issue, especially because the use of plastic remains high. It's only expected to grow, and as we saw at the beginning of the presentation. So in my opinion, we can't rely only on recycling. And as it can be seen here on the graphic, without robust policies and accountability mechanisms, it's expected that both landfilling and mismanaged are actually the end-of-life options that will grow the most in the coming years. And not just that, on top of all of these, the adoption of alternatives, it's still pretty low, or still pretty slow. And at this point, it's become very evident with the treaty failure that voluntary private sector action is more important than ever. But it also means that companies operate in a very fragmented landscape, regulation-wise, that obviously it slows down this change that is needed. Then greenwashing, it has also become a real risk, where companies make claims without solid or sometimes any proof, taking advantage of the fact that the average consumer doesn't technically or doesn't necessarily have the technical knowledge about certifications or end of life, etc. So this is problematic because in a way it takes away the power the consumer should have in their decision making, and it erodes the trust in genuine solutions that are definitely out there. So what we're left with is sometimes accountability being pushed from outside forces like investors asking, or consumers asking for transparency, or lawsuits targeting misleading environmental claims. But voluntary action is challenged, and this is problematic. So if we move on to the next slide, please, and just to provide with an industry example, because despite all these challenges that I just mentioned, there are solutions that are in the market and that show that things can be done today. So one example is the Made from Stone technology, which I work with. But of course, there are also many others playing their part. Some might argue that these are not perfect on their own, but together, when combined with recycling, reuse, reduction measures, etc., they can make a real contribution to cutting virgin plastic use. So with Made from Stone, the technology itself can replace up to 60% of plastic in packaging, in traditional packaging, with calcium carbonate, or simply put, stone. And in some cases, it can even go higher than that. But this material swap, it basically achieves two things. So it directly reduces the amount of plastic or resin needed, and it lowers the overall carbon footprint compared to the traditional plastic packaging that we normally interact with as consumers. And that's because calcium carbonate has significantly lower emissions during extraction, and also at its end of life, it brings additional environmental advantages. So, but what's important here is that Made from Stone is an upstream solution. So we often see, or finance consumers see, plastic pollution strategies that are downstream. So they rely on consumers and at the end of the chain to correctly dispose of a product, or municipalities to have the right infrastructure in place, etc. However, these steps, although they're important, they're also very dependent on human behavior and systems that aren't always reliable. So made from stone can reduce the plastic before the product ever reaches the consumer, by changing the material itself. So this again shifts the responsibility not from the consumer, but back to the industry. And this shows how design choices can make a difference, right? And just to finish up this slide, I would say another strength is that this technology is scalable and readily implementable. This is because it's compatible with existing machinery used to convert plastic as we know it, meaning that there's no need for completely new systems to be built. And there's just a change from the virgin resin compound with the calcium carbonate compound. And so what this shows is that innovation is not just something for the future, it's happening today. Made from stone is just one example of how upstream innovation can directly cut emissions and reduce plastic use. And it proves that solutions are available right now if industries are willing to adopt them. So then now if we just move to the next slide, please. Well, we then have to ask ourselves, what can companies do today? And realistically, to move from pilot projects to mainstream solutions, and of course, acknowledging the fact that regulation is still falling short in many places. Well, here are some things that can be done. None are a miracle solution, but there are things that we should collectively be advocating for. First, I would say invest in alternative materials that deliver a lower footprint, while being transparent about its limitations. And this is because with the current landscape, even if a solution is not perfect, those that can be easily incorporated into the existing supply chains should not be rejected, because we can't wait for the magical solution that's going to solve all of our problems. Second, I would say is adopt science-based targets with measurable milestones. So setting clear goals for reducing virgin plastic use and emissions that are in line with what science says, rather than very ambitious and sometimes unachievable targets, because we've seen major companies stepping down from their goals before. So I think it's important that we prevent that from happening. Another recommendation would be to collaborate across the value chain. So brands, recyclers, suppliers should work together rather than in silos. And with this, I mean investing in solutions through partnerships across the industry sector to favor acceptance of innovative technologies and share the risk. And then to what I mentioned before about greenwashing, we should be thinking about leveraging consumer transparency tools, such as QR codes, verifying environmental impact to build trust. The EU digital product passport might be something that you're familiar with. In my opinion, it's a great solution to foster transparency and consumer empowerment for education. So brands should be doing more of that to get credibility and compensate for all the greenwashing that is out there. And just to finish up my section, overall, I would say that while innovation is underway, as we see, plastic industry, of course, seems to be at a crossroads with structural challenges and all this policy uncertainty, and this means that change is still too slow. Yet, it's still a very decisive moment, because in the absence of the much needed clear global rules, companies have the chance to lead by shaping markets and setting their own standards and proving that scalable alternatives are both possible and profitable. And so yeah, that's all for me, and thank you for listening, and I'll just pass it back to Dustin. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That was a great presentation. We did get some good questions here. I can ask the first one, and hopefully everybody has their thinking caps on. All right, are there countries similar to the Philippines where credits are accepted for compliance under EPR laws, Is PCX or other plastic credit standard bodies working for getting credits embedded in EPR laws in other countries?
Yeah, so I guess I'm taking that one. Yeah, so I mean, there are a few examples of countries that have market-based mechanisms also part of EPR schemes. There's Brazil and India, but they are not necessarily the best examples because there are still many improvements needed because basically the cost for the so-called credits there is way too low. There are no standards. So it's not a great example, and both countries are working on improvements of their EPR schemes. Also in the UK, there is something that is similar to a plastic credit, which is the PRN, the packaging recycling notes. So it's the equivalent that companies need to invest in for the cleanup or recovery. So there are similar, similar types already. And I think the system makes most sense for really developing countries that are starting to have EPR laws, that also countries that do have competing priorities, for example, healthcare and education and other major issues, they can't have like super complex and sophisticated EPR schemes. So it is a way to build an EPR scheme that makes it also very tangible for companies to comply in the first place and to allow money to flow into waste management. And then once they are progressing, we are also looking, for example, in the Philippines now for introducing some sort of infrastructure credit, for example, so that also you build out long-term infrastructure and change the system in the long term. But at least the setup in the Philippines helped really to immediately address the problem and have money flowing into waste management already. So I think that's what we are sharing, the experience of the Philippines. Again, it's not perfect yet. There are many areas of improvement, but we feel that other developing countries can learn from that experience. There is, for example, Vietnam that is in a similar stage. There's Indonesia that is looking into, they have a sort of EPR law, but it's not robust yet. Malaysia had plans. So these kind of countries, they are also looking at the Philippines as an example, as an inspiration and as a learning experience. Yeah, let's put it this way.
Could I ask, Stephanie, sorry, Dustin, to break in there.
No, great.
You're talking about the price being too low in Brazil and India to make it efficient. Do you mind sharing a little bit on the price in the Philippines and how you see, like, what do you need in order to incentivize these kind of collection systems?
Yeah, so I think one, it should really be clear the requirements from the law. What is meant with recovery? Like what steps are needed? Are there any standards? Is there, for example, registration needs for the waste diverters? And is the whole supply chain benefiting from the EPR scheme? So I think one of the difficult points in India was that the informal sector was basically left out of the EPR scheme. So they are now looking to improve the setup and make sure that also the collection part get incentivized, not only the recycler. And the price for that certificate in India, it dropped very fast because companies were just looking at the lowest compliance price. So I think putting in more rigor, more standards, more safeguards will automatically help bring that price back up. But that's something that they are working on in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Yeah, the next question actually sort of applies to that answer as well. Let me just read this. What is the cost economics of buying credits versus fulfilling compliance via the EPR laws? And what is the preference of corporates that need to comply with EPR?
Yeah, so I mean, in the Philippines, it is really like credits are part of compliance. So it's not either or. Credits is just one of 6 downstream measures that company can use for compliance. They can also do their own collection scheme. So there are different options. So it's not, yeah, it's not a choice between compliance and credits, but it's credits that are used to prove the diversion or the recovery targets that they had. I hope that answers the question.
All right, let me read the next one. What are the safeguards required to ensure that alternative materials are not more harmful than plastics from a life cycle approach perspective?
Maybe I can take on that one. So thanks for the question. So I would say to ensure alternative materials are not more harmful than plastics as they are from a life cycle perspective, I think we should focus on end of life compatibility, regulatory compliance, and transparency, as I said before, avoiding greenwashing. Um, I would say alternatives in a way must fit existing processing end of life systems or have verifiable biodegradation paths, for example, avoiding contamination or creating additional harmful microparticles. So compliance with international standards, ISO, EN, etc., ASTM, is essential, I would say. And then finally, life cycle data should be auditable and clearly communicated, and materials with embedded tracking through the form of QR code or any other solutions, is a great option to allow, for this verification from the origin, composition, recycling pathways, or end of life, alongside, chemical safety, food contact grade certifications where relevant, etc. So yeah, end of life compatibility, regulatory compliance, and transparency, I would say.
All right. I have another question for you, Steffi, here. Many companies are still emphasizing recycling as the main solution to plastic pollution. How do you see the role of recycling compared to upstream solutions like made from stone? Oh, I think you might be muted.
Sorry, I lost you for a second, Dustin. Would you
Okay,
mind?
yeah, I can read it again. Many companies are still emphasizing recycling as the main solution to plastic pollution. How do you see the role of recycling compared to upstream solutions like made from stone? I think you're
Sorry, I was
muted.
I was muted again.
Yeah.
Well, as I said before, recycling is important, but it's not a silver bullet, in my opinion, at least right now. Less than 10% of plastics are actually being recycled globally. And that number has stayed, stubbornly low for years. And when in the slide that I showed before, when we look at the projected data, it's still going to remain pretty low recycling unless we have, very ambitious regulations. So the reality is that most plastic, it's either landfilled, incinerated, or leaks into the environment. And that's why upstream solutions are so critical, because instead of relying on consumers or the final consumer to recycle correctly, or on the infrastructure that sometimes isn't there, technologies like made from stone reduce the plastic at the origin, at the source. So we're able to replace a big share of this plastic resin before the product itself gets to the final consumer. So that doesn't mean that recycling goes away or that is not great, because it is. It will always be part of the picture, in my opinion, and made from stone is compatible with that. But the real shift comes when we combine upstream innovation with better recycling and more available. And that's how we cut virgin plastic use, lower emissions, and also building a more circular system.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. This one can really be for all of you. There was a performance-linked world-backed bond that was announced last year for financing public waste management and was serviced by plastic credits from Vera. Can anyone speak to the use and relevance of such mechanism to address financing gaps?
Yeah, I can.
Oh,
I
you want to
can.
go first, Stephanie?
Yeah,
I
or you
fill you in.
go.
No, you go, you go.
Yeah, so I think these mechanisms surely help to build credibility. I mean, the World Bank bond provided upfront capital to 2 projects, one in Senegal and one in Indonesia, and that definitely helped to build out and to make them available for the issuance, to prepare them for issuance of plastic credits. And then the idea was that a part of the plastic credit sale would go back into to the investors, basically. So I think these mechanisms really help to provide some upfront capital and to build credibility, but it's really early. It's only 1 year that it was launched. But yeah, we are hoping for similar financing mechanisms in collaboration with multilateral banks, for example, or governments, to really help boost the underfunded waste management sector, and especially look at waste management projects that are in the middle of the supply chain. So normally the big recyclers, they can get funding, but often the ones in the middle, either collection or segregation, they really are considered often unbankable. So especially for those players that are really needed in the supply chain, these mechanisms can really help. Yeah, Anna, over to you.
Well, I don't have that much to add to that. I think that was a brilliant answer. I just wanted to tap on that. Obviously, we are faced with a massive problem here that is a very costly problem, and it is what Stephanie said, specifically for these developing countries that don't actually have the money and the knowledge and to build these kind of infrastructure systems that are needed. I think that's a little bit the shame as well. We're not having a global plastic treaty because we're talking about trading of actually raw materials across borders, and many of those issues. Basically, one country sits with maybe the plastic production and another one with the consumption, and then another one as a dumping ground. So collaboration across borders are really instrumental. And I think the fact that the World Bank, of course, is going and more blended finance, which is needed to back these countries that are really struggling to finance these mechanisms that are so needed and are really threatening people's livelihoods. So I hope that we get to see more of these types of financing mechanisms. Obviously, carbon credits and plastic credits are one tool. So what Stephanie has been talking about with the plastic credits, how they function, and obviously the fact that these types of bonds can sponsor these very local projects is really something that we need to see more of. So yeah, we're quite excited about that plastic bond and more blended finance from these institutions.
All right, great. We're just about at time here, so I want to thank everyone for joining us, both our speakers and all of the attendees. Make sure to reach out to us for more information on anything that we discussed today, plastic recovery projects, the treaty, credit verification process, or any sustainability questions you might have in general. We will be sharing the video and the presentation with everyone who attended as well as registered but was not able to join today. We'll make all of this available publicly. And we just want to thank you again for joining us and hope everyone has a great day. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.